Hey there guys, what is going on? Welcome back to another Cold War video. Today we are making our first versus video of this year's Call of Duty. If you don't know what a versus video is on this channel, essentially we're taking a look at two or more different things in this particular game and comparing them side by side to determine which is the better option out of the pair that we've chosen. And today we are taking a look at the Akimbo or the Dual Wield 1911s versus the Dual Wield Diamattis, which is basically the Renetti. So this is a fairly interesting comparison, and on paper, if you just look at the raw statistics, you're like, surely the Diamatti just wins this flat out. I mean, and you would think that based initially looking on the statistics, but we're going to have to go through everything here today and test it out and make sure that we do actually have the correct answer for which is better out of the Akimbo 1911 and the Diamattis. Just before we do get into it here, make sure you hit that subscribe button with those notifications turned on. I do very much appreciate it, and it does very much help me out. Of course, all of your support recently has been absolutely fantastic, but about 85% of you guys watching this video right now are not subscribed. So if you could just take like 5 seconds out of your day to just click that subscribe button for me, it would mean an awful lot. We're of course looking for 4,000 subscribers by the end of the year, so hopefully you guys can help me get to that milestone. Alrighty, so as we have done previously, let's just jump into some stats here and talk about what is the best option out of the 1911 or the Diamatti here. So as we have done previously, we've got various sort of categories that we're going to judge our statistics based on, and luckily enough for us, in Black Ops Cold War, we do of course have this very detailed stat screen, which does actually make this very easy. But some of the time, it's actually not super helpful. Like, sometimes the actual statistics are kind of vague and they don't really tell you what exactly they mean. And it's one of those things where you have to sort of read between the lines a little bit and sort of make some educated guesses, and we'll move on from there. So the first statistic we're going to talk about here today is, of course, the fire rate. And we did this previously with some of the other weapons on this particular series. Now, looking at the fire rate, this is fairly relevant, as with this particular option, we are running around and like basically blasting people away at fairly close range, like close to medium distances is where we're going to be fighting with this particular weapon, so fire rate is fairly important. So starting us off here, the stock fire rate of the 1911 is 400 rounds per minute, which is fairly average. That's nothing too standoutish. That's a fairly slow firing pistol in this game. And then you look at the Diamatti and you're like, man, 1,111, and you're like, well, that is insane. There's actually a fairly interesting statistic here. I couldn't manage to actually replicate that particular number over the entire magazine. The 1100 number actually comes from the burst. So when you fire one burst, those 3 bullets do come out at 1111, and that's sort of it. It doesn't actually include the burst delay, which isn't actually mentioned in the statistics page, which is kind of important. So as for sort of a more like calculated time, if you do include the burst delay in that number, it's about 950 give or take. I mean, that's just what I calculated from my measurements there, but it's still much faster than the 1911. And then when you do look at the dual wield options in this game, the Akimbo for these pistols, there is actually a fire rate cap on these particular options as well, but it's one of those options that's kinda not massively significant. Like, it is kinda noticeable, but it could almost come down to my timing error. So as for a dual wield 1911, the fire rate sits at about 372-ish, give or take a few sort of rounds per minute there. For the dual wield Diamattis, as I said, it's about 947 rounds per minute. So there definitely is a fire rate cap on these particular options. Interestingly enough, when I did the testing for the Magnum as well, as you'll see in a later video, the Magnum doesn't actually have a reduced fire rate cap for an Akimbo variety, which is cool. So if we are keeping score on this particular options, we have the Diamatti on 1 and the 1911 on 0 here. Now, effective damage range is a statistic on this particular detailed list that doesn't really seem to mean an awful lot. Like, what does effective damage range actually mean? Now, in my head, I've worked this out to mean this is the maximum range where you'll be doing your maximum damage. I think this is the distance that the game wants you to sort of fight at. I guess it's one of those things that's really sort of arbitrary and doesn't really make too much difference. Mostly you're going to be fighting at close range anyway. But for our effective damage range on these pistols, the 1911 does have an effective damage range of 19.05 meters, which, I mean, that's fairly respectable for a pistol. And then you look at the Diamatti, and it does have a effective damage range of 21.59 meters. So again, the Diamatti does take the lead here as well, with a 2-0 lead for having a slightly larger effective damage range. Again, I really don't know what that statistic actually means, but the range on the Diamatti is apparently better, so that's interesting, I guess. Next, if we do look at the damage numbers here, we are looking at, for the 1911, a 3-shot kill or a 4-shot kill, depending on where you are hitting people. 1911 does do 50 damage per bullet, which is fairly interesting for a pistol, so likely you're going to get a 3 to 4 shot kill, which is very nice here. If you do look at the Diamatti here now, you're going to get a 5 to 7 shot kill, which is That seems like a lot, but again, remember you have to get those bursts. So 1, 2, 3 bullets is one pull of the trigger, and then if you do have 2 pistols, of course, that is 1, 2, 3 more bullets. So you fire 6 shots, you're likely to get a 1 burst kill if you do fire both weapons. So it's one of those things where it's like, it's kind of going in the 1911's favor just based on the actual damage numbers, but it's like very, very close in terms of actual shots to kill because, I mean, effective shots to kill, basically if you do pull the trigger once, with the Diamattis, you should maybe get a kill. So this one's kind of split, but I'm leaning more towards the 1911 here just because the damage number is simply higher. So we'll call it 2 for the Diamatti and 1 for the 1911. Now, the bullet velocity for these weapons is actually a very, very important statistic in these games. Bullet velocity is so crucial, in fact, that if you do have low bullet velocity on these weapons, it essentially feels like you're lagging or the hit detection is really bad in these games. So the higher your bullet velocity that you can go, the more effective you will be at this game. Essentially, we're looking at the bullet velocity for the 1911 first as well. The bullet velocity for this weapon is, of course, 200 meters per second, which is very, very slow. And that's one of the slowest in the game, actually. Like, that's super, super slow. And then, of course, you look at the Diamatti side by side, and it does have a bullet velocity of 250 meters per second. I mean, it's slightly faster, so I guess we have to give another point to the Diamatti here. So I guess we're up 3-1 on the 1911, which is, I mean, it is what it is, basically. It's one of those options where the bullet velocity is very, very important, and there are, of course, barrel options to sort of supplement the sort of low-ish bullet velocity, so you can increase this, but I believe the Diamatti is going to be increased overall once you do add some of these barrel attachments on. And next statistic up is, of course, the minimum reload speed with the maximum ammo capacity, which is a fairly interesting way of saying this is how fast the reload speed is with the largest barrel attachment on, which is what we're using for most of our class setups here, as they do have the most ammo and they do offer the combination of having a very fast reload speed. For the 1911, our reload speed with the 14 round mags is, of course, 1.8 seconds, which is very, very standard. That's a very, very fast reload speed. But the Diamatti is absolutely lightning fast here. Of those 30 round fast mags, 1.26 seconds, which is absolutely ridiculous for Akimbo Pistols. I mean, that is dumb. Like, basically, you just fire some bullets, you reload so quickly, it is not even funny here. So again, another score up for the Diamatti here. I think that's 4-1 now, which is absolutely ridiculous. Another statistic that we're going to look here is, of course, the magazine size. Now, the standard magazine size of the 1911 is 8 rounds, and this can be increased to a maximum of 14, which, I mean, is fairly small for what we're trying to do here. So we're running around, we've only got a number of shots before we do run out, and it actually happens fairly quickly if we are spamming these Akimbo Pistols. If we look at the Diamatti, the default round magazine is 15, which is actually quite large, but you have to remember that does take into consideration that is a burst weapon. You do only get 5 bursts before you do run out of bullets here. And the maximum for this particular weapon is 30, which, I mean, you get 10 bursts, which is fairly efficient at sort of running around and blasting people away. But because you do have to take into consideration that burst, even though that number is actually larger, I think this is fairly similar here. Like, this is kind of a tie, because if you do pull the trigger once, it fires 3 bullets. So essentially, you only get 10 shots with the Diamatti. So we're just going to call it a tie here. We're not going to worry about the maximum magazine ammo capacity here. We'll just write this one off. We'll just skip it here. I think we're still at 4-1. This is a statistic that I made up based on the maximum magazine ammo capacity and the amount of bullets it does fire and the amount of bullets it takes per kill. This is called theoretical kills per magazine, which is absolutely stupid. You should not measure anything by this statistic because you're not going to get like kills like this. Like, this doesn't work. Like, you do have to reload in between a lot of these things. Like, but for the sake of a laugh here, the 1911 can get 4.6 kills per magazine. So in the 14 rounds that it does have per magazine, you can get 4.6 kills, which is pretty ridiculous. Like, you can just run around and get 4.6 kills, almost 5 kills in a single magazine. Of course, as I said, this is a theoretical number, so you're not actually going to get 4 kills before you have to reload. And then you look at the Diamatti, and you're going to get 6 kills before you have to reload, which is stupid. Like, this is a dumb statistic, and I actually love it so much. And of course, the results for this would be doubled for dual wield, but this is super dumb, so don't actually take this into consideration if you are measuring anything by this theoretical kills per magazine statistic. Now, the hipfire spread here, they are very, very similar to each other, but I have to say that the 1911 does actually have a slightly smaller hipfire spread than the Diamatti, which is another interesting option here. Overlaid on this particular picture here, I believe it is flashed up on screen right now which one is which, and you can see that the Magnum and the 1911 are exactly the same, and the Diamatti does have a slightly larger hipfire spread, which is fairly interesting to know. So score 1 up for the 1911 here, and I think that takes us to what, 4-2? Now, the recoil spread is a fairly interesting thing that I've seen here. These pistols are definitely harder to use than we have seen in Akimbo pistol varieties in the past. Like, we've been playing with pistols from Modern Warfare, and they are so accurate at sort of Akimbo varieties. You can make them very, very accurate, run around and basically use them as a shotgun. In this game, it does take a little bit more getting used to, and it's not as easy to sort of get away with running around with the Akimbo Pistols, but it can still be done very, very easily, and you will rack up loads of kills. Once I did switch over to these options and started running around just blasting people away, my games just, I mean, I just rack up like 70 kills and like 20 deaths, which is not great, but I mean, it is what it is. So of course, the recoil spread. In 1911, here we can see on the screen right now, it is basically as expected. It's fairly centralized recoil control. There's no sort of stray bullets or anything like that. They're mostly focused around a center point, and they do sort of bloom out a little bit from there. This is more recoil control that we have seen from previous pistols in other games. This reminds me an awful lot of something like the M19 recoil, the X16 recoil, and stuff like that. The Diamatti, however, is actually quite inaccurate. There is more recoil here than you'd probably expect by looking at this thing. It could be because there's more bullets to fire, meaning that there's more bullet markings overall, making it appear less accurate. But, I mean, you just look at these two pictures side by side, and you have to say that the 1911 does have a more centralized, better recoil control. Now, it's one of those things where you compare these two, and you're like, well, which one's better? Well, I have to say that the 1911 is better, as it does have a better recoil control overall. But the Diamatti isn't terrible if you are running around using these at very close range, like a shotgun. So it is one of those things, however, that we are awarding another point to the 1911 here. And I think that takes us to 4-3 in favor of the Diamatti here. Pretty much all the statistics that I have here today, guys. And our final winner, of course, as I mentioned with these numbers here, is the Diamatti. Now, as we mentioned earlier in the start of this video, this has actually been quite close. I didn't think this was going to be as close as it was when I initially did the testing for it. I mean, the 1911 doesn't seem like the best option, and then you compare it to a burst pistol, which simply has a higher fire rate, more bullets per shot, and you're like, well, it can't really compete, can it? And then you actually look at the numbers and you're like, well, actually, it's fairly accurate, it's fairly consistent, it does good damage, and it has a decent amount of bullets to fire, and you can get a decent amount of kills per theoretical kills per magazine, which is a super dumb statistic, by the way. As I said, statistically, according to these parameters, the 1911 is worse than the Diamatti by slight amounts. I mean, it's one of those things where I feel like it's a little bit more consistent as of that recoil control, and maybe we should award some of these categories a larger slice of the pie when we do consider these points, but at the moment we're going with 1 point per category. Now, if you are looking for what I believe to be one of the statistically better options in the dual wield pistol category in Cold War, I'd go with the Diamatti over the 1911, just simply because of those bursts, that high fire rate, running around and have a good time. If you are getting at those close range kills, you pretty much blast people away very, very easily, and it is a super, super good time here. You get an insanely fast reload speed, good accuracy, I mean, good-ish accuracy, and decent range, like the most range out of any of these pistol options. But if you are, as I said, looking for more of that consistency, that lot of lesser statistical advantage, but I mean just more consistency with that sort of better recoil control and still having decent statistics across the board and good damage as well, you can choose the 1911 here. What would I say is the best option? Well, it's kinda up to you, unfortunately, but hopefully this video did make it a little bit more clear with these weapons about which is best, but at the end of the day, you have to choose what works for you. Anyway, guys, I do appreciate you stopping by and checking out this versus video. We're going to be taking a look at the winner of today's video, which is, of course, the Diamatti, and comparing it up against the Magnum, which is very, very powerful in this game as well. Very, very soon, of course. Make sure you push that subscribe button with those notifications turned on so you don't miss out on the Diamatti versus the Magnum video, which is coming up very, very soon. And, of course, I will see you in the next video. Bye!